Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Healthtech Pigeon podcast, where we do deep dives into the week's best health tech stories so you don't have to. I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague Amy from SomX and Sukrti Nagpal from Doccla. Amy, Sukrti, how have your weeks been?
I'll let you jump in first. It's probably more interesting than mine. So
I like that, the long breath in before that, Amy. So first of all, thanks for having me here. My week has been busy. Earlier this week, I was at the BMJ Future Health Conference, 2 days out there, and then managing the rest of work and life outside. But I'm still holding strong, and it's Thursday, so we're good.
Yeah, apart from being a little cold this week and currently surrounded by 3 electric heaters, I've been doing pretty well this week and have met some of the team actually in real life and had some in real life meetings this week, which has been a real positive. But yeah, looking forward to hearing more from you, Sukrti.
Yeah, Amy and I managed to be in the same building for the entire day yesterday without meeting, so I'm calling that a record. It was not intentional. But, you know, we will make it happen.
One time we will meet you in person.
We will. And Sukrti, you were, as you say, you were at BMJ. How was the conference?
Yeah, so it was their first conference, Future Health. It was jam-packed, really good energy around, in every room and every hall that speakers were in. And actually, I think probably Amy can relate to the fact that it was really nice to see a lot of these key people face to face and actually build those connections. So yeah, it was all in all a really good couple of days.
Fantastic. And you were on a panel with Sam Shah discussing remote monitoring and wearables, right?
Yeah, I absolutely was, with the lovely Sam Shah and Louise Thwaites, who'd come over from Vietnam. We discussed her experience in Vietnam of wearables and patient monitoring, and then we touched on some of the experience over here that I've had within Doccla and virtual wards and the logistics and practicalities of remote monitoring patients here.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sad to have missed it. I bet it was exciting conversations, but I think we're going to probably touch upon a few of the points around wearables as part of this week's stories. So I guess without further ado, should we dive into the stories? So, our first story comes to us from Sifted, and that is that smart ring maker Oura has hit a $5 billion valuation after raising $75 million and has signed a partnership with US continuous glucose monitoring giant Dexcom. In total, they've raised $154 million, and together, as part of the partnership, they will cross-promote and cross-pollinate one another's solutions, combining Dexcom's continuous glucose monitoring with Oura's health tracking ring and app. The first integration of the two is expected in the first half of 2025, so wasting no time after the announcement. It's absolutely an interesting story. It's only been September since Oura acquired their own glucose monitoring startup. They've recently acquired Sparta Science, another health data company. And it comes off the wave of quite a few acquisitions on Oura's part. So I think straight away, I'm keen to get Sukrti, your views on this. This is a big story for wearables. It really is a 10-year road for Oura from sleep app to overarching health tech platform. What's your reaction?
Yeah, so I think this is great. It's really interesting, and I think it just shows us where the market's moving with wearables. Over the last few years, we've seen, everyone's now got an Apple Watch or their Garmin tells and stuff. And Oura has definitely been something that's been on my radar for some time. As a smart ring, I think it's easy, practical for people to use. And whilst it's not necessarily parts of it, not a medical device yet, I think there are, it's going to be really interesting of where this goes. And I think particularly in the kind of proactive population health kind of space, because actually these are usable devices that, well, we can come on to who will be able to afford them or how they can be used. But, I think there's a lot of information that we can gather from these. It's the bit that's going to be key, though, really is going to be when we'll be able to access that data and learn from it, really.
That access to data piece is a really interesting one, isn't it? Because ultimately, a lot of these devices are sort of marketed as consumer tech, right? I think this Oura at least definitely they've, from a consumer PR perspective, from a consumer marketing side of thing, they're still very much that consumer app. They're still going up against they're rapidly catching up with companies like Apple with the Apple Watch and really positioning this as a consumer device. And that brings with it its own challenges, really, which is, they are expanding and acquiring and really integrating lots of really valuable health platforms into it. It's going to be really valuable data from a healthcare perspective. How far do we think we are away from this data actually being really usable? Is this useful for the day-to-day consumers, having all of this data sitting in their probably, I'm assuming, their phone? I know they have a sort of wider Healthtech app that on which all of this data sits.
I think that's a fair question. And when you really come down to it, I'm actually going to ask you that question. Do you have a smartwatch, or do you have a watch that tells you how well you're sleeping?
It's a good question, Amy.
I personally don't.
No. So I think in terms of being able to use the data from a healthcare perspective, as a clinician wanting to see that data, we're away from it. We're still away from it before it becomes maybe a medical device that clinicians will be able to use and maybe trust in that data to be able to validate what their clinical concerns may be. But from a consumer perspective, as someone that has a smartwatch that often tells me I haven't slept enough or that I may well be stressed today, as that individual, I find that quite stressful, being told that I haven't slept enough, and it doesn't help me. But I still wear my watch, funnily enough, mostly now just to tell the time. But I think for those that are quite motivated in wanting to make changes to their well-being, I should say, this kind of information can be really valuable. We touched a little bit on it in our talk earlier this week at the conference, is too much data as an individual, can it actually lead to anxiety as well and increased burden? And yeah, absolutely it can. I've just told you I get slightly anxious when I see that my watch is telling me I haven't slept enough. So what that might do to the layperson, it absolutely can have that impact. So is it helpful to have all that data? For the right person, yes, that will have those will be able to make those changes. But for in the wrong person, no, that can actually increase anxiety and may well. From a clinical perspective, I see those patients come to see me in practice worried about their numbers, and they will show me their apps and their numbers that are showing that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point around the anxiety. I was going to ask that very question, because, is there such a thing as having too much information and too much data? How do you think we might be able to safeguard people that might have negative impacts from that information? Is there a way of safeguarding it or kind of looking out for those people?
So I think in terms of when there's something on the shelf that you can buy, absolutely, I can't stop someone going in and buying it off the shelf or ordering it online. From a clinical perspective, I think it's important as clinicians that we recognise where someone may well develop increased worries or anxiety around their own health data, and help them to navigate that really and understand those numbers. And actually, it happens all day and every day. It's not, maybe 10 years ago you'd have the more anxious patient who had bought a blood pressure machine off the shelf and recorded it and brought in their numbers to show you. And now it's actually, look at my app. Everything is tracked on an app. So there has to be a lot of understanding from the clinician side where the individual is bringing it to their doctor or their healthcare professional to help them make sense of what they're looking at. So data is helpful, right? But you also have to be able to understand that data. So, I'd expect, as my responsibility as a clinician would be able to try and help them navigate that. But at the point of selling, it's really hard. We can't put a kind of a ban or a blanket, if you meet this and this criteria, then you can buy it. But otherwise, no. So there is that challenge. And we are increasingly seeing, that anxiety in individuals, but I'd say it's a clinician's responsibility to help navigate some of that.
Is there a risk that things might get missed as well? If someone thinks that they're monitoring them and they've got it covered and they're monitoring their glucose and they misinterpret it, or the figures are wrong or something, is there a risk that things could be missed?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I also sit in a role of patient safety and governance. So my entire job is to find holes in the system of where patients could or individuals can drop down. So yeah, absolutely. You know, the medical device kind of industry, the regulation part of it is there to try and stop those opportunities for missing this, where a device is not necessarily yet a medical device. There is that aspect that yes, it could miss it, but also, again, data that's not necessarily reviewed by the right person, or the understanding of what that data means that the layperson could miss the numbers being wrong or off, and then not seek advice where needed.
Quite. I don't think I'd trust myself to monitor my data correctly. But yeah, it is an interesting topic for sure.
One of the headlines of this announcement, and ties into clearly what's part of their strategy after their acquisition of Very. And I think we're seeing it in some of the other wearable devices and manufacturers that are out there as well, is that continuous glucose monitoring is a big part of this, and bringing in that element to support people. I mean, the people who will benefit from this mostly will be, I guess, people living with diabetes. And as a strategy, it feels like it's really pushing into that, getting close towards the medical device being, pulling on what you were talking about earlier, which is that well-being point. And I noticed the correction from managing your health to managing your well-being very much there. And it's quite, there's quite a divide, isn't there? Like, in terms of when something does become a medical device, when something's definitely targeting that market. I mean, given what you're doing, in your role at Doccla and the kind of remote monitoring piece that comes out of that, what's the gap between the infrastructure that Doccla has to support remote monitoring and things like smart rings, smart watches? We've got Apple, who have crossed the line in certain bits to becoming that medical device for atrial fibrillation detection, but it's very limited scope for the watch as a medical device. So yeah, it feels like there's still quite a gap between consumer wearables and major remote monitoring infrastructure.
Yeah, and I'd agree, you're right there. So when you look at what we do at Doccla, so we provide the kind of end-to-end solution in virtual care for all healthcare settings. And if you take looking at diabetes, as you just said, in a healthcare setting, the current kind of key players in continuous glucose monitoring, that's their intended use, and it's for the diabetes space. And so when we work with our trusts, the hospitals that want to use our services and set up their pathways, actually we are governed by, to some extent, by the devices they may well already be using and what is available to their patient population. So actually, and hospitals have so continuous glucose monitoring is very much governed at a kind of ICB level of what might well be available for your area and what kind of patches you would be using, depending on whichever brand. But for an actual device selection, actually it's very much done, and it's being more and more so done by engineering teams, clinical engineering teams within a trust, and they will choose the specific device that trust uses. And they've been validated in their use in numbers of patients. They've been around for a long time. You've got your kind of key players and brands that are trusted and well known in the clinical space. So I don't think if wearables particularly in this space, will be necessarily coming in and replacing those patches, for example, that are already well established in use, and particularly within the NHS, because there's been a huge drive around diabetes over the last 10 to 15 years, and around continuous glucose monitoring, with very, very well kind of published researched patches that are there. So I agree, there is going to still be that divide, and actually the challenge is going to be not necessarily the people who are using the prescribed ways of measuring their glucose and actually doing that for whichever diagnosis they have, but actually navigating the ones that are using these wearables from the consumer perspective and really extrapolating the kind of those readings. And actually, until they kind of get into the medical device regulatory aspect of it, there probably won't be a chance that they come in as an opportunity to replace what's already there. And I mean, with anything, it's also cost is going to be a big player as well.
No, I know. I was just going to touch on the cost point because you mentioned that. I think initially in the beginning of the conversation, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the cost of these Oura rings, and you know, is it reflective of? Is it, you know, representative of, you know, what you think, what you'd imagine that the wearables should cost or could cost, and is it you know, disallowing some people who might not be able to afford them, for example, in taking like control of their health as well?
I haven't looked at the price for the Oura ring recently, but I can pretty much imagine where it sits. If we talk about it from whether it would replace some of our existing kind of devices that we use in monitoring diabetes space, diabetes care on the NHS, once you're diagnosed with diabetes, is actually you're entitled to free prescriptions for the rest of your life on that, around that treatment of that. So, and there are other conditions that meet that criteria. So, you know, at the moment, and actually in some areas it's now reducing, but at the moment you have to meet a certain criteria to be able to go on to continuous glucose monitoring, and it is related to the type of diabetes you have and the severity, and what's been agreed in your local ICB pathways. So whilst the cost of one Oura ring or one of these wearable devices that can do this might be less as an initial, in fact it would be less over that lifetime depending on the period of that life of that device, for example, it would ultimately, I mean, part of it would need to come down to, is it an equivalent, and actually is there a cost efficiency for it if we got to the point that it was an equivalent to what we have in the NHS.
And do you think that's what they're trying? That's what they're aiming to do. They're aiming to get it regulated as a device.
It's really hard to tell. They came on the market, didn't they? Initially, they've very much come on the market as a well-being, like you said, consumers at the beginning. Now, as a clinician, I think, okay, to continuous glucose monitoring, why is that useful to me? I'm thinking about it when someone's got an established medical condition. So, and certainly in where I work and the role that I have, it's usually for monitoring of health conditions that we would be thinking about. And there's a huge market out there, but there is also a huge population out there that don't have those conditions and that are happy to purchase this and are interested in their well-being. So they have probably no need to move into that space if they didn't want to.
It's interesting. Obviously, they've had a lot of acquisitions and are kind of covering a lot of ground, and it seems like this particular niche that they're fulfilling is working. You know, that people want to know, they want to, you know, and then they've got the branding, they've got that behind them that people are actually buying the product and they like it. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, kind of comparing it to the actual medical. You know, as you were saying, that there are glucose monitors that you give to people with conditions, which is needed. And then there's this kind of other piece of it now, which is people can choose to do that if they want.
And it's huge in the fitness industry. I mean, people are, or anyone that's wants to understand what they're eating. If you can, and how it affects your body, you can purchase a continuous glucose monitor and apply it yourself, and you can track your diet, how you react to it, what pushes your sugar up, what doesn't, and learn from it. So it absolutely doesn't need to cross over into the medical side of things at all. It can sit in the well-being space.
Is that useful? I'm asking from a position of ignorance here, in terms of the sort of I guess the subculture of people, you know, buying these for sort of well-being monitoring tools and, you know, identifying, what you eat and whether it drives up your sugar. I mean, I will look at a sandwich filled with sugar and be like, well, I could be pretty much guaranteed that will keep my sugar levels up. Or if I see a cookie, it's like, yeah, I know I'm going to get really hyper and then I'm going to have a crash or something like that. Is it beneficial to know that? Is it useful?
Yeah, so there's been a huge amount of work, and I think, and also lots of information in the media news over the last few years around glucose, gut microbiome as well. So when you look at glucose specifically, when you're feeling quite tired, you might go for your chocolate bar or your bowl of sugar, as you said, to get that hit to kind of wake you up a little bit. But actually, the information around, the science behind it is if you give yourself a huge hit of sugar, you have to produce enough insulin to kind of bring it back down to keep your sugar in a normal range. If your sugar is too high for sustained periods, it has other effects on your body, and actually you can get pushed into a state where you don't produce enough insulin, or you spike too high, and actually over time you can develop the effects of you can develop diabetes, so actually and other organ dysfunction. So it is important we think about what we're putting, what we eat from a glucose perspective and our gut microbiome, because we know that it has effects on kind of a long-term conditions. And actually continuous glucose monitoring is quite fascinating, because having done it myself, you'd think that actually a bowl of porridge, healthy, should be nice, nutritious breakfast. Make it with water, pushes your sugar up through the roof. Make it with milk, reduces it a little bit. Add a bit of peanut butter to it, keeps your sugar normal. So it's the combination of different things, and also in the way you cook your foods, or that can also impact your sugar spikes.
That makes a lot of sense. And if I have my bowl of bread tonight, CGM could tell me not to have the bowl of bread tomorrow.
Yeah,
or whether I can get away with
it. Yeah, and actually at night your sugar will spike higher as well, quite typically. So you can I think just even by doing a bit of tracking for a couple of weeks, you can learn a little bit about how you respond to different foods.
I think we need to get a live update on the next podcast, Hugh. You need to tell us what a bowl of bread does to your glucose levels.
Yeah, I'd like to know.
I shall look Spencer an Oura ring, so I won't promise that yet, but maybe that can be maybe an ongoing theme.
A bonus.
Anyway, lots to think about. I will come back in several weeks with an explanation of my sugar levels. Until then, probably time to move on to story number 2. So, story number 2 comes to us from Healthtech News, and it's going to get everyone talking, I think, which is what is holding the NHS back from innovation, and what do we need to break those barriers? There's a lot of perspectives and views and thoughts in this article from some very interesting people, both on the supplier and the NHS side, in this article about what is holding the NHS back from innovating. I think we can all acknowledge that there are barriers and challenges and struggles, but of the top ones that have been identified in this article: funding constraints, bureaucratic processes, cultural resistance, fragmented innovation efforts, and implementation challenges. I think most people listening to this will recognise at least one of these, probably all of them in some cases, but I think it's definitely an interesting discussion to have. Sukrti, what's your reaction on this one? You're closer to this than either Amy or I am. I'd love to hear, what rings true for you.
I mean, when I read this article, it's kind of like, what doesn't it cover? It encompasses pretty much every challenge that we face. So I hold a clinical hat at my local hospital, and I've experienced all of these parts to it, and also from the other side of where I sit within Doccla now. I think if you look at the article as a whole, it can feel quite daunting, actually, and quite overwhelming. And it's a bit like trying to change the wheels on an aeroplane, but in this case, we're trying to kind of improve every single part of the aeroplane at the same time. And it makes you think, where do you begin? But it summarizes every aspect of it well.
Certainly quite a long read, and I think it was a little overwhelming actually, because it gives quite an interesting view on the resounding barriers, but it is a big problem, and there's also the article it's not talking about solutions, it's talking about problems, so it does feel a little overwhelming to read. I felt a little sad for the procurement teams when I was reading this. I don't know how they felt if some of them read it, but obviously that was one of the things that was mentioned quite a bit, just on that kind of particular procurement piece. My thoughts are with the team, the procurement team, and whether they felt individually singled out. But maybe you could speak to that a little bit, Sukrti. Like on the procurement side, I'm quite interested in that. And what can we do to change some of those processes that they say are slow and blunt? And I think the quote was even from Marcus Bohr, catastrophic project failure and total market stagnation. So I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, it was a fairly daunting kind of, doesn't leave you with a real positive outlook on how you can make change in this article. So from the procurement side, and I'll just talk from my experience and really my learning as I've sat and worked across different parts of the NHS, the kind of decision to maybe bring something in comes from higher up. Actually, this is what we want to put in. This is what we think is going to fix the problem right now. And actually, procurement teams are a kind of the next step down, and they go into a market which, you only have to look left, right, and centre and see there are kind of lots of options out there. What one do we use? And they will come up with a set of criteria to try and have some standardized assessment of these different solutions or products that they might well want to bring into. I don't want to say fix, because I think they're enabling improvements to care that we need to make, and just moving with the times and digitization. And it's hard, actually really what you need as well. And some of the things that I certainly heard this week at the conference was actually ensuring that you've got the right people sitting on the procurement team as well. So it needs to be the people that will be utilizing it, or clinicians that are going to be, if it's something for clinical, it needs to, that's going to be caring for patients, clinicians that will be utilizing these solutions, these tools, and then really kind of having a really clear understanding of what the problem is we're trying to solve as well. So I think you're told we need to put this solution in, for example, let's say, I'd like to say virtual wards, because that's probably where I sit most in and I have done for the last 18 months. We want to put in this way of virtually supporting patients in the community, and actually you have a procurement team that is involved in choosing it, but they also need to have an understanding of what their current landscape is and what the services they already provide and how that tool might help. Because actually some of these things are already well established in a community service, where actually a virtual tool may improve what they're already doing, or actually they've already got quite a good setup, but actually it's not necessarily about putting the tool in to fix what they're already doing, but it's putting the tool in to try and expand what they're already providing, and how can we share that with more patients. So one of the big resounding things for procurement was making sure that you've got people who are going to be utilizing it involved in that stage, so that actually it won't feel like we're setting ourselves up for failure.
Definitely a really good point to make sure the right people are involved, right, in the decisions. And there's another point which is related, but about building in-house technical capability within the NHS. It's kind of related to the procurement part, but a slightly different piece of it. And I wondered if you, I mean, you, as Hugh said, you're closer to this than we are. If you've, if you've seen kind of that movement developing, and any thoughts to add on that? How we do that? How do we build that in-house technical capability, which might remove some of the barriers of procurement?
So I think that's a really really key thing to mention, and also I'm happy you've touched on it, because you tend to find that innovation and building in-house solutions is very, let's say capital centric, or where the funding might well be, within the teaching establishments, where there might be lots of research. And actually, I think one of the key things at the beginning of that entire part was from somewhere at Norfolk and Waveney. So that's where I grew up. That's nowhere near central London. And actually trying to be able to being able to make sure the innovation is equitable across the NHS is quite a challenge. There is some amazing work going on within London and some of the trusts where they have got this in-house kind of technological advancement. They have teams that are working on AI solutions that work for their population. But it really, one of the key things in here is funding. So actually it tends to be where you've got the big institutions surrounding them and actually have that funding to be able to support that innovation in-house.
Yes, always comes back to the funding, doesn't it? It's kind of a little bit of a cycle, some of these things, the procurement, the skills, the technical, the funding, it's all linked. And that's probably why it does feel a little overwhelming to read.
Yeah. There's one ray of sunshine, I don't know what, silver lining in the cloud, around the cloud at the end, but it was the Headspace article. And I think whilst it wasn't necessarily the solution to all of these problems, it was definitely addressing what we need to try and get to the solutions. I think it was almost out at the bottom, and it resonated quite a lot with most of us that work within healthcare, is that you need to have headspace to be able to think of solutions and to be able to create and innovate. And it was not just, it was looking at from both sides. So, actually firstly empowering the frontline staff to change things, but also thinking from a senior level, actually, where do we want this to go in the long term, and having the headspace to think about, whilst we might be implementing something, we want an immediate return on it, but actually where do we want to be in the long term? And you need headspace to be able to think about both for that change to affect.
Do you think that's not currently happening, that people don't have the headspace?
Yeah, I think most people feel like they're probably on a hamster wheel. It's, if you're a clinician that's working in the hospital, you go in on a day-to-day basis, and actually we're November now, it's winter, it's busy. We're thinking more about what's coming through the front door, and have we got enough beds to manage that? Have we got enough staff to manage our appointment list for today? Actually, can we get all the operations done that we've signed up to do? So we're still very much trying to manage our day-to-day bit, but also trying to think of the long term. And there often isn't just maybe that headspace to think.
Do you think that's a role of a clinician, though, to be thinking about innovation in that way?
So maybe 15 years ago, when 15 years ago as I started out as a junior doctor, probably not. I wouldn't have thought that way. But as you work in the NHS, you then realise what kind of tools you need. You see the things that maybe could work better. And actually, if you see the gaps, who's better placed to help with thinking of solutions, especially if they're going to be tools that clinicians or healthcare practitioners are going to be using. So yes, I do. I think clinical involvement and product development is really important.
It is a silver lining. I'll be interested to see how we can get to that point. And I think the cultural shift piece in the article is going to be the real challenge. But without the time, how do we get there? So our final story looks outside of the NHS for innovation and to insurance, and that is that French insurance startup Alan has unveiled an AI health assistant that will be available to its 680,000 health insurance members. This took me by surprise this week, I'll be really honest, given that the amount of healthcare chatbots that are popping up, the amount of places that AI is being used and chatbots are being used to solve healthcare problems. But ultimately, I think it's an interesting story and one we really have to touch on this week. Yes, so Alan has brought to its members an AI-powered health assistant named Mo that will enhance its services. So Alan's members will be invited to use the app use the chatbot even to ask questions about their health and help navigate both access to healthcare, but also raise their medical and healthcare concerns with the chatbot directly. The Alan app already has a chat interface, which is normally administered to by doctors within minutes. Doctors respond to members' questions with their clinical opinions. Now we are not exactly taking doctors out of that equation, but very much adding AI into it. And that is that patients will ask questions of the chatbot will provide a response, and patients will ask questions of the chatbot, and the chatbot will answer using AI. Within 15 minutes, of course, the clinician will vet and verify or question, provide an opinion, let's say, on the answers given by the chatbot. But there is, at least for me reading in this article, an interesting question as to whether that's quick enough, whether that's soon enough, and how far this AI becomes, I think, to earlier points, a medical device, and where the burden on verification and checking questions from patients comes, and who is responsible for the output and what happens after it. So, Sukrti, Amy, I'm really keen to get your reactions to this one, because this is going to members. This is going to be an interesting use of AI. It's not clear whether it's a generative AI chatbot or a more algorithmic NLP chatbot, but I think the questions are still equally applicable. What does this idea mean?
So it's interesting to hear some of the things that you've already thought about, Hugh, with it. And actually, I think with my kind of clinical safety, thinking about patients' lens, I would agree. And actually, as a non-clinician, Amy, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, because actually, if you were that person using it, how would you feel about it? And then I might tell you all the things that I think about it.
Well, I think as a person using the chatbot, so I think first it's important to mention that you do get a choice. I think that was, they did mention that you get, they notify you and you get the option. So there is that element of choice, which is positive. You're opting in to use it, which I think is important to mention. As a trust issue, isn't it? It comes down to trust. We know that generative AI, even if we don't know the details of this, has a tendency to hallucinate and create scenarios and things like that. So there is that piece, although they're saying that it's checked by a doctor within 15 minutes, which is a really interesting piece of the story. So as a user, you're questioning, you're using the chatbot, but then it's checked by a doctor within 15 minutes, which gives you that reassurance that the information, hopefully, is factually correct. But then it also begs the question of why use the chatbot in the first place if it's being checked by a doctor anyway. So, but it's interesting, and maybe having that, ability to get that immediate response that you might need is actually still very valid for addressing medical concerns you might have. But yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts as well, Sukrti, on it.
It's good to hear that you're thinking some of the things that I'm already kind of thinking as well. So I think we are gonna recognise that there are going to be more and more of these AI agents used everywhere, and more so within healthcare. When I look at this article and I read through the process, it doesn't tell me a lot of things that I'd want to know, like what kind of questions that an individual might be able to ask. Also, as a clinician, I'm still trying to navigate the risks of AI. As a person who's being asked, do you want to use the AI agent because you'll get a quicker response? Do I, as a patient, would I know all the risks? And actually, if I hit yes, but I don't understand what that means from can the AI hallucinate? We don't know what type of AI this will be, but could there be hallucinations? What data has it been trained on? And it's giving me an immediate response. As a clinician, I'm worried that what if I ask them something that actually in those 15 minutes before a clinician has validated it could actually cause harm for that patient? And that's my biggest kind of gap in this, is actually there's 15 minutes, and 15 minutes is actually can be quite a long time for certain conditions. So, in certain health questions. So there has to be, and I'd like to think, without knowing more, that there'll be some clear regulation around, what you're able to use it for, and ensuring that if we are offering out to, if it's being offered out to its users, that there's some explanation of what the risks are, and they do understand that side of it. Doesn't necessarily protect them, because I think we are all very aware. We always click through and accept as well. There's that alert fatigue. You just notify and go through, but also this is quite complex information to understand, and AI is quite complex to navigate. So do I expect my patient to be able to have to navigate it? I don't know, and I don't think so.
Yeah, it's interesting, that point around making it really clear to the patient as well that they are talking to an AI or a chatbot, because it's, especially for people that might have different types of medical conditions that might impact their visual or hearing or anything, or even just people less used to technology like this may not understand the risks fully. Like, this is a kind of unrelated example, but related. My dad was very confused on a Facebook fan page for, I think it was Eric Clapton or something like that. But he was talking to who he thought was Eric Clapton. Obviously, it was an AI chatbot. But he was asking it questions, and it was giving very sophisticated answers about very detailed things in Eric Clapton's life. But he couldn't believe that it was a chatbot. So I think there's just some people out there that just wouldn't clock. So it does have to be made clear.
And there's something about believing the written word as well, right? As well, so you may well believe it's right. But there's things around its intended use. It's kind of the oversight and monitoring of it. What happens with the data that comes through? And actually, if it's my insurance company, what are they doing with that data? Does that have can it impact the other parts of my insurance that I may well have with them for my healthcare? I will follow this one with interest to see how it's used, because definitely there's a big... So definitely, we are cautiously approaching AI within the NHS. We are using it and things, but definitely there's definitely layers to checking and oversight.
I can't get my mind off this, this idea that everywhere we have used AI in or intend to use AI, there's quite often that check of the clinician does. The clinician must check the output. The clinician must check the result if it is if it's a clinical decision, if it's a differential diagnosis kind of support tool. The clinician, it must go through, and the ultimate accountability lies with that clinician. And it strikes me that 15-minute window, is, as you say, anything can happen in that, and any recommendation could come out of that, assuming it's generative AI. We don't know. There's not enough in the article, as you say. So it is a very interesting thing. On the flip side, I'd be very interested if it was something that was more of a guide to medical information, because we have the NHS website, we have things like Mayo Clinic and all of these wonderful repositories of information that do inform and educate patients that aren't clinical tools. That you're not getting a diagnosis from something. You might be getting scared that you have something when it presents you a few different options. But if it was a tool that was helping you sift through that information versus a clinical style support tool, I think there's a big gap. And I think we've got to be really careful in how we talk about these tools when they are patient facing, as to what they are. What is the purpose? What is the objective of them? And I think I'd Definitely one to watch, because I want to know what it is. I want to know what kind of information is being provided. If a clinician has to review it, that's interesting in itself. But if that's at the end of a 15-minute window, that's an interesting concept.
I just wanted to raise potentially a slightly controversial point, but there's been stories around certain chatbots and AI diagnosing conditions more accurately than human clinicians. How does that relate to this story, given that there's AI involved, there's also a clinician involved. We don't know if it's diagnosing, but I just wanted to raise that. And do you have thoughts on that, and how you see humans and human clinicians and AI kind of working together or separately to diagnose things?
Yeah, so I think, Amy, the kind of AI that you're referring to is where it might well be used on image recognition, which as well kind of has been established in dermatology. It's been established in, it's being established in radiology, and also even in imaging of the back of the eye. So there's been learning on huge data sets and pulling out that information to make a diagnosis. That is then still screened by a clinician. You're absolutely right. In some cases, actually, has been found to be more accurate than a clinician in diagnosing certain conditions. And I think in those spaces, the tools work really well, actually. So I don't think it's necessarily a replacement to a clinician. It's an adjunct. It's a tool that the clinician can use to help make their diagnosis and navigate and manage a medical condition. Yeah, so for example, in the dermatology space, it's been used for quite some time, where you've got, a huge volume of patients in the community that might go and see their GP, and they're worried about a skin lesion. And actually, to be able to examine skin lesions, and we're using a dermatologist will use an instrument called a dermatoscope, which allows you to magnify the lesion and really look carefully at the different structure within it to make a diagnosis. If a GP at the primary care point, if they're concerned about a lesion, they can refer it into locally. We've got the photo hub, so the patient will go in, have their images taken, and actually it gets uploaded to our local platform. It goes first pass through an AI system, and it will go through, a benign or is this more serious kind of diagnosis. Now, all of those, but it's able to do it quicker, right? It's the speed. It allows it allows the volume of those images to be reviewed, which then can help you triage into, actually, do I need to review this patient sooner? Or actually, has it come out confidently as benign? Can I look at that in the next 48 hours type thing as well? So where the AI might pull out a benign lesion, it will give you a clinician still reviews it within 48 hours to confirm, but it allows you just to even prioritize and triage on that initial kind of set that's come through. And then where it might be more, when there may be more, where the AI is unable to determine, it then gets put under a clinician's eye straight away. So there are areas where it's being used to help flow and ensure that we can manage the volume and the demand that's coming in.
Linking back to this story, do you think that they are trying to use the technology to to speed up the process, essentially triage and basically support better care?
Yeah, so I think without having more information on what they're going to be using it in, actually getting a response from a doctor within 15 minutes in this country is gold dust. That doesn't happen. So actually, the insurance providers obviously have a level of service that is provided, the way you get a clinical opinions, but and enabling that, there must be a kind of a subset of questions that probably wouldn't necessarily need a clinician to respond to. And like you say, there might be the information that's sitting there on the NHS website that has carefully been curated by a clinical team that is valid and up to date. And actually, I'd like to think that this would be for those kind of that subset of things where actually we can signpost people to information, because that's actually, maybe it's that first touch point within healthcare is just advice.
It is almost certainly going to be better than ChatGPT questions when you need healthcare advice, though. So, I mean, I think this is a super exciting one to watch. I have no doubt when we get a bit more info, we'll be discussing it again. But this has been a great first conversation about it. So thank you so much, Sukrti, for joining us for today. Before we do go, is there anything you're working on, anything you want to share with listeners that, if people want to get engaged or contact you about anything, how should they do it?
Yeah, thanks. First, thanks for having me once again. I'm always happy to talk about remote monitoring, virtual wards, patient safety, and I'm constantly working on different projects within that space within our organisation. And actually, if anyone that's interested, please just reach out on my email, which is sukrti@doccla.com.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Sukrti. Thanks, Amy. Thank you, producer Adama. And thank you, everyone, for listening. It's been the Healthtech Pigeon podcast. You can find the stories we've discussed and loads of other really exciting cool jobs, podcasts and events in Healthtech on the website at healthtechpigeon.com. We'll be back next week. Bye.